table under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Mad Hatter were having tea at it. Dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it and talking over its head. Very uncomfortable for the Dormouse, thought Alice, only as it's asleep, I suppose it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at one corner of it. No room, they cried out when they saw Alice coming. There's plenty of room, said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in the large armchair at one end of the table. Have some wine, the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. I don't see any wine, she remarked. There isn't any, said the March Hare. Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it, said Alice angrily. It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited, said the March Hare. I didn't know it was your table, said Alice. It's laid for a great many more than 3. Your hair needs cutting, said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with quite the curiosity, and this was his first speech. You should learn not to make personal remarks, Alice said with some severity. It's very rude. The Hatter opened his eyes very wide upon hearing this, but all he said was, Why is a raven like a writing desk? Ooh, come, we shall have some fun now, thought Alice. I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that, she added aloud. Do you mean that you think you can find out the answer to it? Said the March Hare. Exactly so, said Alice. Then you should say what you mean, said the March Hare. I do, Alice hastily replied. At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know. Not the same thing a bit, said the Hatter. Why, you might just as well say, I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. You might just as well say, said the March Hare, that I like what I get is the same as I get what I like. You might just as well say, added the Dormouse, which seemed to be talking in its sleep, that I breathe when I sleep is the same as I sleep when I breathe. It is the same with you, said the Hatter. And here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about writing desks and ravens, which wasn't very much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. What day of the month is it? He said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then, and holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little and said, The 4th. 2 days wrong, sighed the Hatter. I told you butter wouldn't suit the works, he added, looking angrily at the March Hare. It was the best butter, said the March Hare. Yes, but some crumbs must have got into it as well, the Hatter grumbled. You shouldn't have put it in with a bread knife. The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea and looked at it again. But he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark. It was the best butter, you know. Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. What a funny watch, she remarked. It tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is. Why should it, muttered the Hatter. Does your watch tell you what year it is? Of course not, Alice replied very readily. But that's because it stays the same year for a very long time together. Which is just the case with mine, said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to her to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. I don't quite understand you, she said, as politely as she could. The Dormouse is asleep again, said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea on its nose. The Dormouse shook its head impatiently and said without opening its eyes, Of course, just what I was going to say myself. Have you guessed the riddle yet? Said the Hatter, turning to Alice again. No, I give up, Alice replied. What's the answer? I haven't the slightest idea, said the Hatter. Nor I, said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. "I think you might do something better with the time," she said, "than wasting it in asking riddles that have no answers." "If you knew time as well as I do," said the Hatter, "you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him." "I don't know what you mean," said Alice. "Of course you don't," said the Hatter, tossing his head contemptuously. "I dare say you never even spoke to time." "Perhaps not," Alice cautiously replied, "but I know I have to beat time when I learn music." "Ah, that accounts for it," said the Hatter. "He won't stand beating. Now, if you only kept on good terms with him, he'd do almost anything with the clock. For instance, suppose it was 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner." "I only wish it was," the March Hare said to itself in a whisper. "That would be grand, certainly," said Alice thoughtfully, "but then I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know." "Not at first, perhaps," said the Hatter, "but you could keep it to 1:30, as long as you wanted." "Is that the way you manage?" Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully. "Not I," he replied. "We quarreled last March. It was at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing 'Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder where you're at.' You know the song, perhaps?" "I've heard something like it," said Alice. "It goes on, you know," the Hatter continued, "in this way. 'Up above the world you fly, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle.'" Here the dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep. "Twinkle, twinkle, 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 twinkle," and went on so long they had to pinch it to make it stop. "Twinkle, twinkle." "Well, I'd hardly finished the first verse," said the Hatter, when the Queen bawled out, "He's murdering the time! Off with his head!" "How dreadfully savage!" exclaimed Alice. "And ever since then," the Hatter went on in a mournful tone, "he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now." A bright idea came into Alice's head. "Is that the reason there are so many tea things? Is that why there's so many tea things put out here?" "Yes, that's it," said the Hatter. "It's always tea time, and we don't have any time to wash the dishes." "Then you keep moving round, I suppose," said Alice. "Exactly so," said the Hatter, "as things get used up." "But what happens when you come to the beginning again?" Alice ventured to ask. "Suppose we change the subject," the March Hare interrupted, yawning. "I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story." "I'm afraid I don't know one," said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal. "Then the Dormouse shall," they both cried. "Wake up, Dormouse," and they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes. "I wasn't asleep. I heard every word you fellows were saying." "Tell us a story," said the March Hare. "Yes, please do," pleaded Alice. "And be quick about it," added the March Hare. "You'll be asleep again before it's done." "Once upon a time there were 3 little sisters," the Dormouse began in a great hurry, "and their names were Elsie and Lacie and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well." "What did they live on?" said Alice, who always took a great deal of interest in questions of eating and drinking. "They lived on treacle," said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two. "They couldn't have done that, you know," Alice gently remarked. "They'd have been ill." "So they were," said the Dormouse. "Very ill." Alice tried a little to fancy to herself what such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on. "But why did they live at the bottom of a well?" "Take some more tea," said the March Hare to Alice very earnestly. "I've had nothing yet," Alice replied in an offended tone, "so I can't take more." "You mean you can't take less?" said the Hatter. "It's very easy to take more than nothing." "Nobody asked your opinion," said Alice. "Who's making personal remarks now?" the Hatter asked triumphantly. This was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping they would call after her. But the last time she saw them, they were trying to put the dormouse into the teapot. Madam Toastmaster.